So I've come in and I've done the clouds using my PBO drawing gum, a liquid Frisket. Now I'm going to wet the entire surface. Then we are going to pour these three colors onto it. I've got Prussian blue, phthalo blue green shade, and Holbein's Peacock. So those are all very transparent colors. Yeah, okay, so let's get some water on there and then I'll get the bucket in place. So I need to wet this down. I want to pre-wet this because I'm finding that the colors don't want to run across here as well as I'd like if it's not pre-wetted. Of course, this will thin my colors just a little bit. I suppose if I had an even bigger bucket of paint, maybe they would pour across there easier. Some of the pouring that I've seen people do, they actually do it in a lot of thin layers. Thin layers are going to probably run across here a little easier than a thicker layer. Okay, it's a pretty warm day today. This is probably going to dry fairly quickly, so you need to keep moving here. Let me look at it from the side to be sure I've really wet everything, which I didn't. And make sure it's evenly wet as well because I'm seeing it's wanting to puddle in places. So down here I can really sort of see what the, yeah, it's not wet there, it's not wet there, not wet right there. Okay, I think that's pretty wet. Darkest up here, lightest down there. So let's just dive in and see what we can do. Let's see what kind of a mess I can make out of this. Let's start with my lightest color. You know, you probably can't see that from up there. Let me just move this over a little bit so it's more under the camera so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm pouring on paint. I'm going to stop and not have it go quite that far, although it doesn't really matter if this lighter paint gets down into where the darker is going to go because and you know, I'm going to just take my brush and help it along here a little bit because it's wanting to just jump. But we do want it to sort of run through here. So that's my lightest color on there. Let's make sure it's covered everything. And I'm doing this with my big brush so that I can do it smoothly because I want that to come out and be pretty even through there. Now, do we want to actually put that darker color on yet? It's going to be up in here. Pour down some of this. I need to shake it a little bit more. It looks uneven. This is definitely making a mess on my desk. Okay. Now I need to pour the excess back out of here. Let's go ahead and get my cup back underneath of there. Let's help it a little bit in a few places. All right, now I can roll that around. I may not need that third color any longer. Get that off of there. Okay. So, how are we doing here? Let's get a little excess off of this brush so that I can come in and just move a little bit of this. I'm also feeling like maybe I'm going to need to just add a little bit more in there. so that it doesn't end up. Some of it's going to have to come back off that corner. Take a little off my brush. Just come in with the brush and take a little off that corner. That little spot right there. Careful with the brush. If I leave that square brush on there, it's going to have a square brush mark, which I don't want. Now let's also come back in with my rag and just pick a little bit of this off of up in here. I did leave a few little holes in this masking fluid when I put it on, so that some of the blue would show through in a few spots. So I'm not going to worry about that if some of it's that is there. Let me just see if I like. Ah, yes, I do like this much better than what we did in the previous samples. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off, let it dry, and we'll see where it goes. I started this painting last week. All of the clouds, I decided that after doing a series of experiments with this, trying various different ways of pulling these clouds out of it, I decided what I wanted to work with was doing the clouds with a liquid Frisket. Liquid Resist PBO is what I'm using, drawing gum, and around the edges I did sort of a dry brush method of putting the resist down onto the page, and then I poured and brushed paints, peacock down in here. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out. Anyway, we did a darker blue at the top, a lighter blue at the bottom, and did a little bit of a blend in between. So now what we need to do is take the resist off with my lifting tool, and we'll start here at the corner. I really liked in my experiment what happened with putting the liquid resist on using a dry brush technique where I put the brush real sideways to the page and just let it sort of skitter across the top of the texture of the paper, and really liked this uneven edge that it was going to give me. Fun to take the stuff off and suddenly have the white pop out, and it's like, oh yes, that's what this painting was all about. Even though the turquoise color of the PBO in itself becomes an interesting color in the picture. And I left a few little sky holes in this so that there were a few little darker spots that are going to be in those clouds. I hope they worked in the end. But there were places where the sky came through these clouds, and I wanted to let some of that happen in the final. Don't want too much of it, but enough to make it look natural. So as I'm seeing this come open, I'm thinking about how I'm going to come in and start building those cloud shapes on there. So this gives me a new little white area to then develop the cloud shapes without interrupting the sky. And that's the really cool thing about holding your whites with a resist, is that it allows you to paint very smooth areas in the background and then come back in and work on these foreground areas without having to disturb any of that background sky. So I'm going to want to start with my lightest color, whatever my lightest color is. And in this case, it's going to be a very pale yellow. And then there's a little bit of pink that comes in there, also quite pale. And then we start getting our grays. Finally come back into the brain. The blue that I used up in the top of here was Prussian blue. It's a darker version of phthalo in that same sort of green staining, green-blue staining range. Okay, so now first thing is to mix myself some yellow, and clean this brush really well. And which yellow do I want to use? You know, because it's going to lean a little bit toward that peachy side, I'm going to go ahead and use New Gamboge. It's one of my favorites. I use it a lot. I like the warmth of it. And so we're just going to come in really quite thin with this. I need to thin that down even a little bit more than what I had. And just find how this yellow is just very thin across some of these areas, and maybe I want to lift a little bit of that so that it's not too dark, because we want that feeling of white too. And maybe I won't put any there because I like that feeling of white. And maybe a little bit here, thin it down a little more, get a little more water on it, and just let it come and find its way cross through here. Sort of going to work around some things. There's a little tiny bit of it on the top of all of these clouds. Got to be careful about having that too dark of a yellow, and just come in with a damp brush and pick up some of that paint I just put down and spread it around a little bit. You notice I'm sort of patting with my brush as I do this, partially to get an uneven brush mark as it comes down. Just get a little bit on there. Okay, now I'm going to come back and do just a wee touch of pink, which is my quinacridone rose. I have to be careful that this looks like it was a little bit dirty up in there. Clean that off. That's a little bit better. And then thin this down quite a bit. It's easy for this to get way too strong on there. I just want a touch of it. Just want a hint of pink. And it's around the edges of that yellow, sort of going down into the clouds, and maybe just a little bit up there. Now let me thin that down just a little bit, because I want that soft on that edge. So just a little bit, just so it's just sort of giving this a little roundness and a little warmth. And then just a little bit of pink at the top edge of that one. It's like there's a little halo that's happening around those clouds. And so I'm wanting to leave pretty light in some places on the edge, and then just a feeling of this little pink. And then when we do the gray, it's going to come in and go in on top of that and darken that even more. That's looking pretty. And then it's going to find us down on the bottom edge of these. I have to thin that just a little more so it's not too pink. It's going to go more gray when we put the gray on top of there, but this will glow through. So putting these little pale colors underneath of a gray area allows that gray to take on a slightly shifted color, and it makes it look much more lively and realistic. There are a lot more colors, and gray is made from the three basic primary colors anyway. And so being able to sort of shift it around and have part of it shift a little toward pink and a little bit toward yellow and a little bit toward green and a little bit toward purple and maybe a little shifting in toward orange in places are going to make your grays and look much more natural. It's not going to be a strong color, but there's just going to be that hint of color moving in from underneath that will give this a little bit more vitality. It's one of the very exciting things about watercolor is that watercolors are transparent, and being transparent, you can see a little tiny bit of what's underneath. And so it's the good and the bad of it. It's always a little difficult sometimes to know for sure what's going to show. And so, you know, sometimes we're afraid to put things in because we don't know how it's going to show through later. Areas that are going to go darker, you know, a lot of that's going to get hidden. Okay, so I think I'm at the point where I need to stop on this and let this dry, because if I come in and paint the gray on top of here while it's still wet, I'm just going to muddy it, and then these colors will get picked up into the gray and just get mixed with the gray and not sort of stay as a special little layer underneath. Just a couple little spots there that I didn't like the edges on that, and I can fix it now. And actually, that's probably okay because we're going to have gray that comes on down. So let's just take this pink even a little more down into here. Okay. Stop on that. It's a little too pink right now, but when we get the gray on top of there, that will hide most of that, but it'll get a glow of a pinkish feel coming up through there. I've allowed the painting to dry completely, and so now I'm going to start doing some of the grays on here. Our photograph, you can see that there's some nice little soft rounding on the clouds as it comes up into this, and then it's a little bit darker in underneath of here. None of these clouds are anywhere near as dark as this black, and they're not as dark as that dark blue. So I need to think about that as I'm darkening these up. Now some of the grays down in here tend a little bit toward being a warmer gray than what's up there. So that's something else to think about. And I've got more pink down in there, so maybe it'll already show up without doing anything else. I've let this dry after the layer that had the yellow and the pink on it, the quinacridone rose. I started to do just a little bit of gray, and then I started again. So now what we have mixed over here are 4 different shades of gray. I have cobalt blue as the base of this gray. This is a red-brown gray, and this one is done with ultramarine blue, and this one is done with phthalo blue. So that's the leaning, but they've all been grayed down using either burnt sienna or one of the other colors that I had here to gray them. Now, let's go ahead and see what we can do here. So I've had this, you know, light colors underneath that are going to show up through here, and I want to make this fairly thin. What we were starting to work with here was this ultramarine blue gray. And so I'm going to just put it on here a little bit thicker than what it'll be in the end, and then thin it out by pulling that dark. So I don't want to do too much at once because I don't want to end up with hard lines on this. So you put down the dark and then you slowly pull that dark out into other spaces. And I've got to work relatively quickly because I don't want this edge to dry before I have a chance to grab it and thin it down. So I'm making a graded wash out of this, leaving a little bit of the dark behind for the darkest part, and then grading it up into my next area to make a nice little soft round look here. So I'm in between each time I come down onto the page, I'm drawing my brush, and now I'm going to add just a little bit more paint here. There's two ways that we can get a grade like this happening. One is like I'm doing now, where I'm just sort of finding those edges and pulling them out. And this is already starting to dry, so I need to work that edge just a little bit more, and I might have to come in. You have to be a little bit careful about coming in with too wet of paint, because if it's too wet, then it's just going to make a big blossom next to that dark. So you want just a slightly damp brush. So I rinse my brush and then take it back into my my rag and dry it down so that it's mostly dry. And if this feels like it got just a little too light, I can put just a little more dark into there. Pull that down into here just a little bit. I'm doing lots of going back to my rag and drying my brush. I need to do that to keep it happening smoothly. And so let's try a little bit of this one that has the cobalt blue in it as I work my way over here. Just putting it down a little bit dark, rinsing my brush, drying my brush at least halfway. I need a little bit more than that. And then I'm just pulling it up into here. Just thinning those edges, pulling it along. And just letting that be a little thinner down on the bottom there, and then you get this little bit of light that happens down at the bottom of those clouds. I can sort of work some of the cloud spaces. That cloud is really nice and light all the way across it, but it gets a little darker over here, so let's just take a little tiny bit of that brush paint. I've got just a little on my brush and it's fairly dry, so I'm just sort of patting this on here to get that to go down. Yeah, that's working pretty good, and we'll want a combination of these three colors. The one with the phthalo is a little greener. This one here is pretty neutral. The one that I've mixed with the ultramarine blue leans slightly toward the purple side. So it's going to be just a little play back and forth here. Now I'm seeing a little bit of dark running through here and a little light on that edge. So we're going to sort of play that shape as I come back through here. So I'm going to play that shape, comes down in here further, goes over into there. And then that's about all that I can put down and still control those edges. So now I'm going to take and pull this paint right on up into this space here. I can just paint right over those spaces that were the little sky holes that I left in there. And now rinse that brush, find this edge. Now there's a few of these little spots that are fairly hard. I probably don't need to soften this entirely. I can just soften it a little bit. Leave a little of that behind. Soften, soften, soften. Let's come back up into here and go a little bit darker and underneath of that cloud. get my face in my head in the middle of this. It's always this desire to get really close to what I'm working on, but in reality, it's better for me to stand back a little bit, let my brush work from a distance, than to come right in on top of that. And I'm just thin that a little bit. And let those come through there. And then maybe some little darker pieces can go across that sky just a little. And come down. We're not necessarily doing it exactly the same as the picture, but what I want to create and feel is this feeling of the clouds moving in there, that you get these little up and down bits and angles of stuff coming through, and some light spaces and some dark spaces. And okay, so let's come back to this slightly darker one. It's a little more purpley, and we'll just work it in through here. And I can come, and there's a nice little shape right there. I can leave it right at that. And then we're going to need to drag this out, thin and soften those edges. Now here it was wet when I put that on, and so it's moving right up into there, so I don't have to do a thing with that. So this is the other game that you can play some, is having it a little wet and then painting right next to that, letting it feed into that wet space, damp space. You don't want a real wet space, but a damp space. And those are not going to be as light. This cloud, that cloud are my lightest. Some of these pieces are the lightest. This is light, but not as light over here, so I'm going to put just a little paint on there. And then now let's drag and pull this down into here. Just working a little bit at a time. Maybe that's going to get lightened just a little bit in the middle of that, and then I'll pull some of that paint down into here. Go slightly more into a brownish shade down in here. Ooh, that's coming up pretty neutral. So anytime you do a rounded shape, this idea of putting down a little dark line and then pulling it out from either side to make it look rounded is the game you want to play. This is my slightly browner combination, and let's let this have a little bit more darkness right in underneath of there. And now play this down into these. Wanted to let that dry for a second before I pull that up. Get a little bit of that bluish look back into there. I do like this browner gray as part of this. This is actually looking pretty nice in here. You notice I'm not talking very much because I'm needing to concentrate on this as I'm working, and sometimes it's hard for me to chitter-chatter when I've got something that needs a lot of concentration. Making this look somewhat natural with the little smoother edges. I think that's working fairly well. maybe some of this can come and come right out onto that sky there a little bit. And then this one, let's see, I like that cobalt blue. It's not just straight cobalt blue, as you can see. I do believe I put a little tiny bit of phthalo into that because there was some on the edge of that pan, and then I added burnt sienna to it to gray it down. Now I've got to get this hard edge softened out. And I'm going to need to do that next edge just a little bit so it doesn't end up with hard line too. And so cleaning my brush, drying my brush again. This time I'm going to come in right on that other edge, that almost clear edge, and try and get a clear piece of water on that to pull that up. And then there's just a little bit, this could go a little darker over there. Some of these pieces could go a little darker. And all of those up there could go a little darker. And maybe I don't want quite that much on there, so I can come back in with my rag and pick some of that back off. And I don't like these white spots down in here. It's beautiful and white up above, but it's really not white down here at the bottom. And I'm not worried about the fact that I'm painting over the blue a little bit, because those clouds can be a little dark on top of that blue. And let's soften that edge, bring that in there. And then let that brown, that brownish gray, little warm gray. So that one was leaning a little heavier toward my burnt sienna. I do believe I had actually mixed this using New Gamboge and quinacridone rose in there to start with. I mixed it the other day, and sometimes I forget what I did. Combinations are similar. Burnt sienna just gets you there a little faster because it's a brown, but it leans a little toward the yellow side. So when I'm mixing grays, I can think of it as being either orange or yellow to go against the blue, and that's why it works so well. Okay, let's see here. As we get down in here further, these ones don't have as much, and they get a little more into that brownish shade as I come across there. Okay, that's probably about all I can control, so let's get back on that, rinse my brush, come in, clean up those edges at the bottom, soften it on the top. Maybe have a little bit of that run across there, just a little. Maybe we don't want that quite as dark at the top of that. And we want those edges to all get darkened out without any white spots down here at the bottom. The white spots at the bottom look a little wrong. And then rinse this. Soften that, soften that. You know, it's always a hard decision on whether to leave some of these hard edges or to soften everything. Those clouds are pretty soft looking. I don't see a lot of hard edges in there, but sometimes a little hard edge here and there actually adds to the sort of excitement of it. So I'm just making a little bit of a dark spot there. Maybe this should go a little darker right there as well. And then let's let some of this be just a hair darker. Just want to give this a feeling of interest. If it's too bland and we don't have any real dark in there, it's going to look uninteresting, just sort of blah, blah, blah. And it's one reason to shift these grays so that you get a variety of grays in here, because that also adds interest to it. Now, I haven't put any of this green gray in there. Is this going to be the wrong gray? Let's go ahead and try some of it down here in the bottom. And it might be that that's the color I'm going to want to do. I have a feeling that I'm not going to like that. Let me pull a little bit of that blue in with it. I have a feeling that might be the perfect color to do those tree silhouettes. Let that dry just a little more so it's a little thicker, and then let that be the tree silhouettes so that they've got just a little hint of green, and also toward the phthalo green, which is going to be similar to the sky. And so that might end up giving some excitement with that. Let that be a little light back in there. A little darker on those. So just going in and out with the shapes, because that's what the cloud does. It's not just a straight line, it's an uneven line. Maybe I can come in and paint above some of this. This is going to make that cloud, this part of the cloud, stand out a little more, to come in and do a hard line in there. And then I need to soften that out, see what it's going to do up above. Okay. Anything else I want to do on here before I stop? Maybe soften this just a wee touch. I was feeling a little too brush marky, so coming back in after it was dry and just doing a little bit of, actually it's 3/4 dry, coming in with a damp brush and just working on it a little bit to soften it up a little. That seemed to help some. Here's another spot that feels a little too hard, and then I can soften that down into there just a little bit, and that looks pretty good. Take my rag to that and just soften it. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there, look at it from a distance, see if it looks like it should, and then think about whether or not I want to put those dark trees down here in the bottom. It does sort of anchor that bottom corner. I haven't been putting the dark trees in all of these just because I'm sort of concentrating on doing the clouds, but that might end up being, especially since I don't like these little bloopers things here. And is that dry enough? You know, I think that's dry enough. I could do those dark trees right now. We decided we liked this dark green paint for that. So, and sponge. Let's try it with the sponge. The sponge, of course, is a little bit wet, and so it's not quite as dark as that paint. Now, corner in here dark. I'm going to need to make a little bit more darker paint here. Let's see, that was phthalo blue. This is my phthalo. Bright sienna. Phthalo blue. actually think I'm going to need to use one of my red browns or add a little bit of red to this. I can add some quinacridone rose into there. A little more of the burnt sienna. A little more quinacridone rose. Just a little more burnt sienna in there. And I think that's getting pretty good. Okay. So I'm coming in with my brush just because now I can get this a little bit thicker on here. I liked what that outer edge did with the sponge, but I felt like I wanted this just a little thicker for most of this. Let that come up a little higher there. And then I'll come back with the sponge and do just a little more sponge work on this in the end. But I did like this tie down that's happening with having these dark trees at the bottom. Letting those clouds be back behind there. Now let's try getting the sponge into this and see if we can do some more sponge work to get the feeling of those little small leaves in here. If I press down really hard with the sponge, it's going to really flatten out. And if I just hit it lightly with the tip of it, then I get the little leaves. So it takes a little tiny bit of practice with that sponge to be sure that what you're doing is what you want. Okay, I'm going to stop with that. Okay. That dark actually helped make those clouds look a little more lively.